what's the opposite of downloading? I guess uploading.
Uploading.
Yeah, and it's like most people now are using like that side of the data sphere, I guess, and so it's like kind of fucking up networks, because they're not used to that alternative flow of data.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of like Spectrum in SoCal got completely wiped out of the internet last night, including myself, for like 3 hours.
Seriously?
Yeah, and they had like 30,000 complaints within like 10 minutes or something crazy.
Fuck.
And
It's funny you say that because Suddenlink up here went down and AT&T went down, and I was working from home and I had to go into the office because I literally couldn't work from home.
wow,
It was
you're Suddenlink, huh? That's
no,
right.
it's actually awful. Like I wish I could do a podcast just on this. How Suddenlink has a monopoly over the whole Truckee, Tahoe, Reno area,
Yeah, I know that.
and
Yeah.
it's fucking horrible, man. Like because everyone just gets screwed over and they're not expanding their bandwidth. And yeah, I could
Yeah,
really go on.
that's funny. I forgot because like I work with Suddenlink to place ads on their cable spot. Like if someone wants to buy political ads in Tahoe, which I've done before, I have to contact Suddenlink, and I just forgot that that's who your provider is. And I'm like, yeah, they suck. I've emailed.
They're horrible.
I've emailed them. They're not easy to work with. They like don't reply at all.
Storm Suddenlink.
Storm Suddenlink. Okay. Okay. Sorry that took a little while. Which one do you want
No
to
worries.
start with?
It doesn't matter to me. I mean, we should put out the governor one first.
No, let's just do that one first then.
Yeah,
you're
exactly.
right.
Yeah.
Okay.
I did a kind of a, which if it's okay if I go into it for the filibuster, I did kind of just a history of it in the United States. So could I intro that one maybe?
The filibuster.
Okay?
I can intro the governors then.
Sweet. Yeah, if that's fine, I'd be down for that.
Okay, cool. Then let's get going. You ready?
I'm down.
All right. Let's see. Let me get over to. There we go. All right. Recording in 3, 2, 1. Hello. Welcome to the Tonic Accord podcast. Today, Alex and I are going to be talking about governors. We've obviously had a lot of political focus on presidents and senators in the last few months, and governors were kind of on the side. Well, the recent developments with a few governors have kind of put governors and state officials in the spotlight. So we're going to be talking about Texas, their power grid, and their Governor Abbott and how he's responding to the Texas storm. We're going to be talking about Governor Cuomo. And how his scandal regarding, COVID deaths in nursing homes and how that's going to affect his political career, as well as Governor Gavin Newsom and a few others. So, this is an episode to catch you up on what the hell is going on with governors in America. All right. So, Alex, my buddy, my friend, and my co-host, Alex Capico, everyone. How you doing, man? And what the hell is going on with governors?
Well, first off, the American flag behind me fell over right before we started recording. So I don't know if that's like a bad omen for anything, but yeah, the flag fell off. But anyways, life is okay. Hopefully you're good, my friend. And I think that my theory is that governors have never been perfect, and there's a lot of shady things that governors have done. And the COVID-19 pandemic, kind of because our country is so divided right now, we kind of picked sides and picked favorites, and the media bought into that as well. Fox News loved Ron DeSantis, Greg Abbott, and CNN and MSNBC loved Cuomo until recently, loved Gavin Newsom until recently. And I think that's part of the problem is that we were all at home for the last year, almost a year, yeah. And the media kind of picked sides, and the country picked sides, and now we're maybe finding out again, especially with these Cuomo revelations, what Ron DeSantis is doing, the hypocrisy of Gavin Newsom. I think we're finding out that governors are people too, and just because they're either for or against Trump doesn't mean they're perfect or the devil,
Yes, I think that's an interesting point because let's think about what governors were doing in 2019, right? Before COVID, I don't imagine there was much importance people put on their governors. I mean, here in California in 2019, there was a recall Gavin Newsom movement, but everyone thought it was a joke at the time, right? Because they're like, whatever, he just got in, whatever, it's pretty liberal. He's taking on the homeless, and that was kind of everyone. There's not really much to Gavin Newsom, but then I think that with COVID, And with this Texas storm, it's putting the importance back on local government again, and state government, which kind of in the same umbrella, right? Because again, we had so much attention focused on the president and what is Trump doing, what is Biden going to do. But this is a stark reminder that a lot of what happens in our states and things the buck stops with your governor. And the decisions your governor makes and the actions that they take publicly really affect our state, the state and the people in them. And I think this is in my opinion, this is like governors coming back to the forefront, for scandals is bad, right? But overall, it's a good thing because it's a stark reminder that, hey, we need to hold our governors accountable. These guys are full of faults and hold a lot of power, and the decisions that they make do in fact impact. And frankly, the decisions your governor makes probably impacts you more than the president.
Definitely. No, and I think you brought up an interesting point here, that it almost seems like we kind of forgot about the role of states. And because of the Wild West nature that our country faced during the onset of the pandemic, states were forced to fight for themselves, do their own thing. And it almost did act at the beginning to me as kind of an experiment in some ways of what works and what doesn't for working with your economy, working with your public health officials. And one of the optimistic sides of this whole last year to me is that we did see, say, what happens if you stay open? Or what happens if you do a hard shutdown, like in California over the last, November to December type of period. And it was actually interesting as a political science person. It was interesting to see, what happens if you stay open, what happens if you stay closed. And there were some positives to that. But I think also, we forgot the importance of states in this entire crisis and just in the governance of the United States. And so, when I'll start with Andrew Cuomo. If you're down, I'll just kind of go into him first, because I think he is just the poster child of this kind of renaissance of what governors do and maybe how we view governors, because he had a lot of scandals in the mid 2010s, like 2013, 2014, 2015, from allegations of sexual assault, all the way up to covering up a different commission into violations of ethics inside of the state of New York. And that was all kind of brushed under the rug. It wasn't covered enough. And then basically he had a strong man, great media presence involving COVID. And, he did these daily press conferences. He got a daytime Emmy down the road. Wow. He wrote a book, and people were joking about him potentially jumping in and beating Biden, during that 2020 presidential campaign. And to be honest, I was one of the people who was agreeing with that, because I didn't know that much about Cuomo other than that his dad was the governor. He's the governor, and clearly he likes governing, he likes power. And now in hindsight, obviously it's 2020, I think that now we see that maybe this guy got to power in some of the shadier ways. This current scandal about covering up, or at least not allowing the release of all the nursing home deaths. And the fact that he was, saying we're fighting this, and people saw him as a strong figure of fighting COVID, but then at the same time, they're covering up data. And they're not listening to experts, because experts said you don't want COVID in nursing homes, and they were putting sick older people back into nursing homes, according to reports. Right. And then on the flip side, you have Ron DeSantis, who is kind of cast off as a thug, an evil man, a Trump supporter. And to be completely honest, I think that the last couple months have shown me that if we're going to condemn Ron DeSantis, we need to condemn Cuomo too. You can't say that one is great and the other is bad. And I think that's the problem in the U.S. is that we've never looked at some of the ones that the media have touted as amazing.
Yeah, I mean, look, it doesn't take rocket science to see the link between mainstream media and CNN and Governor Cuomo. I mean, his brother works at CNN as one of their main anchors. So yeah, I mean, one, that's a good reminder of, reminder of mainstream media bias, as well as two is just how so crazy it is that some of these families, these political elite families, are so entrenched in our political discussion, right? Like you said, his father was a governor before him, and his brother's a top anchor on CNN. It's like I'm watching an HBO show, but yeah, I mean, it's also a good reminder that pride comes before the fall. I was kind of with you. I didn't really know too much about Cuomo. I knew that New York had it really bad at the beginning, and that he was working really hard to get it under control and try and get people to be wearing masks on the subway and stuff like that at the very beginning. And I at the time I thought, oh well, he's trying his best. But I mean, to me, like lying about COVID deaths or fudging numbers in any way, whether it's nursing home deaths versus hospital deaths or anything, but any kind of like obfuscation of these stats regarding a public health crisis, to me, is like he should resign. I don't think this is a scandal he should be able to come back from. This is not the oh, he made a bad joke. This is like, you lied about people's loved ones dying in a pandemic, and you threatened another politician, a New York Assembly member. You threatened to politically destroy him if he came out about the obfuscation. So in my opinion, he should resign. He's done. I'm never going to support Andrew Cuomo after this. I might like what he has to say about something else, but I don't think he should have a place in the New York politics. Now, will that be the case? I don't know. If we look, I'm reading here on Forbes that it looked like he had a 6-point dip in approval from February 12th to 21st, which is that time period in which all this came out. But with 57% approval before and a 6-point dip, that means he's still down at around 51%. I don't know if he'll feel any political pressure to resign, but that's what I would hope he would do.
Yes, and I don't think he's going to resign, first off, because he clearly has an ego that I think rivals Trump, at least from the interviews and the reports of just how he acts as a person. And, the first thing I will say is that I think there's a lot of infighting inside of the Democratic Party of New York. So I kind of take some of these reports with a grain of salt because okay, so some of these more progressive, more, I would say AOC, more squad-aligned congressmen and women, they don't like Andrew Cuomo, and they know he's toxic to the agenda they want to push. So, and he has always been somewhat of an establishment, corrupt, like almost vision of what corruption looks like inside of New York. And I feel like there's infighting that is maybe being politicized on the left, and the right is now eating it up and saying that it's a bipartisan issue where the left and the right are both angry. And obviously I'm not going to discredit that, because if you're someone who lost a parent in a nursing home, it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or Republican, you want to see the numbers and you want to know why Cuomo, against the advice of experts, was putting people back into nursing homes and then wouldn't allow the release of this data. It's not a great look, and that to me is kind of where we're at, that I actually, and bear with me, I think Cuomo is the Democratic version of Trump. I think that there was such a willingness for people to, go for anyone who was against Trump that they didn't really see the forest through the trees. But this is a guy who is super vicious against the media. I've watched several press conferences. He attacks them if they attack him. He's, huge ego. He kind of has this mob-like persona where if you go against him, he blackmails you. And I was reading a great article out of The Hill that talks about how he clearly doesn't believe experts. He believes his own gut instinct. And that actually, Bill de Blasio, for example, did not want to do indoor dining and other things in March. And he basically told Bill de Blasio, no, that's not allowed. He tried to veto Bill de Blasio's decisions. And to me, it clearly shows that Andrew Cuomo was unfortunately propped up by the media, especially because, like you said, it's not a great look when his brother's doing, 15, 20-minute laugh fest interviews with him in mid-March or April when people are dying. And I think everyone was so focused on anti-Trump that they didn't realize that maybe there's a Democratic version of Trump amongst us. And I think this is going to be interesting because, clearly the Democratic Party wants to stay strong inside of New York. So what do they do with him? And I think he does need to resign, but he doesn't. And then that brings up a whole other problem of what do they do, but I'll digress from that.
I mean, it's funny that you bring up that he could be the Trump, the Democratic Trump of New York. I mean, he's probably literally in the same clubs, right? He probably knows exactly the same people, the same wealthy elites of New York that Trump literally knows, like property developers and all that. So it's probably closer of an analogy than even originally thought. I don't like the idea of. I really don't think it's a good idea for the Democratic Party to be putting their eggs in the basket of political elite families. I think we've been down that road before, or they've been down that road before, and it didn't work. I don't like the idea of like Hillary Clinton lost, so let's get her daughter. Like, no. And so I'd be very happy if Cuomo, if this was a long-term, had like a political ramification for Cuomo. I think that would be good. I think it's again, like I said, I think it's an impeachable offense. I think it's worthy of resignation. Yeah, I'm not going to defend him just because he has a D by his name. I defended some of his actions back in the COVID times, but I also did not live in New York, and so I wasn't there for everything. And frankly, you know, after this, it's like, damn, dude, you can't really lie about deaths. That's crazy. So, good point about the Democrats in New York. Will they hold Cuomo accountable, or the progressive wing are going to be able to hold him accountable or not? It looks like probably not. Again, that political machine in New York is really strong, just like any major city. I think any major city, whether it's Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, Dallas. You're going to have strong political elites. So not city, but I guess New York State. But obviously, he's a New York City guy. You're just going to have a lot of political machinery that's tough to crack.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And no, I honestly, I think that's kind of the thing that pisses me off, to be frank, about Cuomo, is that this seems like kind of a late 1800s Gilded Age, like kind of a political mob family, you know? The fact that, I mean, as you know, I'm sure I've told you, Bill de Blasio I am not a fan. But he's like, yeah, we get calls like this all the time. Like, he was not surprised about these reports of threatening calls from Cuomo. He's like, yeah, I've been on the end of those calls. So to me, it sounds like Cuomo's, excuse my language, pretty shitty dude, to be completely honest. And I think that he put in some pretty Machiavellian like orders and laws right off the bat, and I think some of them worked, but the fact that like Trump ordered a naval vessel off the coast of New York, and they eventually accepted it, but at the beginning they tried to I just think that unfortunately Cuomo wanted to be the anti-Trump, and he so much wanted to be the anti-Trump that he was down to actually cost lives to do so. Mm-hmm. And you know, I don't like Trump, you don't like Trump, we've talked about this a lot, but if Trump wants to help and we're in a pandemic, accept the help. Full stop. You know? Yeah,
regardless of who it is. Yeah, exactly. Public health comes first before any of this stuff. And that's obviously the line in the sand that he's crossed. So that's one governor. Let's talk about some other governors. Let's go over to, you mentioned Ron DeSantis. Let's catch me up to speed on why he's in the spotlight.
Okay, so I read a Great Economist article about a year ago that he's a lot more moderate policy-wise than people think he is. But he's obviously, in my opinion, looking to run for president in 2024. Mm-hmm. And I actually argue, could actually be a front runner because he's actually done a quite good job of balancing Trumpism with like old school conservatism, if that still exists.
Yeah.
But the problem is that he clearly favors his base. And we see that time and time again. It's kind of the Trumpian thing, is that he rewards people that like him and goes against people that don't, which is not a great way to bring a state together or the country together. But so there's a couple things. DeSantis is looking at new restrictive voting laws, which a lot of Republicans, I mean, you and I have talked about this off the air, is that they are looking to, I think there's about 120 different congressional like legislatures or state legislatures or like all the above around the country that are currently looking at stronger voter ID laws. So Ron DeSantis is in that. Florida may have had the most fair election in history, according to a lot of scholars, but he's calling for more secure elections, which to me means, guess what? The Democrats got too close to winning, so we're going to clamp down on that. The bigger thing is that I actually don't think Ron DeSantis is given enough credit. I think a lot of people point fingers at him for being against some of the more strict COVID lockdowns. Which I don't agree with. He's been very anti-mask. He hasn't had a state mask mandate until as of recently, and he's clearly on the Trump bandwagon. But actually, Florida's done significantly better than I was expecting. So again, like I said earlier, if we're going to point fingers, let's point them at Andrew Cuomo and Ron DeSantis uniformly. But the bigger thing is that the COVID vaccine. He's got a bunch of criticism because there's Manatee County, which is south of Tampa Bay. Boo Buccaneers, by the way. And so basically there's 2 zip codes that are the wealthiest in Manatee County. And he put 2 vaccination facilities there. Some people argue it's because they're older demographics who need it. Others argue it's because they're white, wealthy neighborhoods, and he's keeping vaccines from, more minority or poorer neighborhoods. There's not enough evidence out to do it yet. But when he was criticized by the media, he says, okay, well, I'll just move more vaccination sites to other counties that I prefer. So he does also have this kind of like, I'm not going to apologize. I'm not going to step down. I'm going to fight. And it's very Trumpian. I would actually argue, like, just being a political science guy, I actually think he might have one of the best chances of running in 2024 and doing well, because he's kind of actually survived the Trump presidency pretty well, and he kind of seems like Trump. So, yeah, sorry, long rant aside, but yeah.
No, that was a really good rundown, because you kind of caught me up, and I pulled up this Politico article that says DeSantis crushes Rubio and Scott in a Florida GOP poll.
He's popular, man.
And that goes to exactly what you're saying. So so check this out. This was cool. So part of the survey included a hypothetical 3-way primary for president, in which it was DeSantis, Marco Rubio, and Rick Scott. And DeSantis got 64% of support compared to 12 for Rubio and 10 for Scott.
Damn.
Yeah, that's a crazy lead. He is by far the most popular politician in Florida, among Florida GOP. And then that's about the same number. 67% said DeSantis is the biggest Trump supporter. So again, you can kind of see a correlation between they believe DeSantis embodies the Trump movement the most, more so than Marco Rubio and Rick Scott. And then because of that, they also then support him. They're on board with that idea. And then it says, and so, yeah, I think you're right that, like, DeSantis has a way better shot at 2024 than Marco Rubio or Rick Scott. I mean, Marco Rubio has been a joke for a while, in my opinion. But yeah, you're right. DeSantis is kind of doing what we were interested in seeing what would happen, which is how do the next generation, I guess, or the next step of the Republican Party adopt and adapt to Trumpism, and how do they, package it up into something that can win elections? DeSantis seems to be at least doing that the best so far in Florida. And it is interesting that I think, both New York and Florida had over 1 million COVID cases. And I think that New York had something like 50,000 deaths, and Florida's at like 30,000 deaths. So they're both, they both got hit really hard with COVID. And it's interesting to see that Cuomo's scandal is directly related to his failure of handling COVID well. And DeSantis is popular because of the way he handled COVID and not calling for state lockdowns and stuff. It's interesting. It's interesting to see how the difference is in what people want out of their governors.
Absolutely. And just the last thing I'll add to that, it's not really about him specifically, but it's kind of about the right or left debate on how governors should have handled COVID. There's a great Economist article that compared Texas and California, and it looked at how they were actually great examples of different, options on how to deal with the pandemic. Texas took the more libertarian approach. Greg Abbott only mandated masks over, I think it was last month, or no, it was back in December. And then obviously Gavin Newsom did the other side. You couldn't even eat outdoors in the sun. And ironically, they both had about the same death numbers. I have them here. Hold on one second. Texas had 127 deaths per 100,000, and California had 104. So 23 less California had. But considering that California used I would argue, draconian measures and Texas didn't, I think that because we're so polarized, we're not actually looking at the fact that it's interesting that not much was different between these states, and that's why I think, in a nutshell, DeSantis could actually still do very well, is because he never locked down, and the deaths were comparable to states that did. And I think that's something that's nuanced, and we haven't looked into it enough yet, but I think over the next couple of years it's going to happen.
Well, I mean, we could dive a little bit into it. Let's look at the nuance
Sure.
because now, well, I will definitely agree, and we'll get into a little bit as well. Is Gavin Newsom's COVID response certainly had a messaging issue, and he had his own little scandal regarding it. But let's remember that California was one of the first ever to get the cases, right? It was Orange County that was one of the first out of like 4 cases in the U.S. was in Orange County, as well as the connection of Chinese tourists and travel in and out of Asia to the West Coast is a lot quicker and more rapid and consistent than it is to the East Coast, right? Because, people fly from Asia to the West Coast all the time, stop in San Francisco, stop in LA. So there is that. Like, I think COVID was just in California earlier. And it's also worth mentioning that, again, that these long-term strategies are more about maintaining the ability of the healthcare system to take in sick people than it is about, limiting the number of cases. I think, the science was there that, look, unless we literally live inside of bubbles for forever, this will eventually spread through the population. The idea is limiting how much that impact has at one time.
Yes.
So again, I'm not saying that California did it good and Texas did it bad. It is way more nuanced than that, and a lot of things California didn't do very well. And one of it was enforcement, because, like you said, Gavin Newsom wanted, he wanted you not to be able to eat outside in the sun. But I tell you, man, if you wanted to find it, you could. There's a lot of places that were not enforcing these rules at all. In fact, the last few months, this is anecdotal, but the last few months, I actually don't even people don't even act like there's a pandemic other than wearing the mask in the grocery store. Whereas in April of last year, it looked dead in LA. The freeways were closed. It really was on lockdown. Like, no one was doing nothing. But even during the supposed lockdown of November and December, some restaurants cut the clothes down again, but it didn't really seem like people cared that much. So I wonder how much of it is just a population fatigue. But it is worth noting, though, that there were differences in the way these different states handled things, and we can see some differences and some similarities in the stats. California's idea obviously was not perfect, because I think it's like half of everyone in LA County had COVID at some point, which is just crazy because I live in LA County. So I'm not exactly happy either. But so that being said, let's get into what Gavin Newsom, his little scandal.
One thing,
go ahead.
One thing really fast is I just wanted to say that, I'm not trying to defend Texas or California.
Sure.
I just think it's interesting because I think there was a bit of the worst of both worlds in California, where it was like, it was like they're frustrated because people are feeling like they're getting, okay, well, we can't go anywhere. Also, the economy's tanking. Also, we have high cases. Like, at least in Texas, you could go eat outside. Or I just think that that's the thing, because we're so divided politically, that it's easy just to say, well, Texas bad, they're open. California good, they're taking draconian measures. And I hope that with Trump hopefully riding off into the sunset or the upside down, whatever he does, I hope we're going to start maybe having a more nuanced conversation about, because I agree with you on hospitals. I totally agree with you on hospitals. But if I want to go eat outside and support a local business, I've never understood why Gavin Newsom, purple tier counties couldn't do that. Yeah. I call BS on that, But anyways, let's get into Newsom. So go for it.
Yeah, well, that's a great launching point. Because you're right that Gavin Newsom was pretty strict about even outdoor windy dining, right? For a while, it's back now, but for a while it was gone. And that led him to have his own little scandal, which was in the midst of telling everyone to shut down. I have it here. Let me grab it up. So I read this article from Lincoln Mitchell. He teaches political science at Columbia University. He argued that Gavin Newsom's little French laundry scandal is no reason to toss him out. I agree with that end result, but I do think it's important to hold him accountable for the scandal. So what it was in the middle of Gavin Newsom telling everyone to stay home, he attended a dinner party at the French Laundry, which is a famous and very nice restaurant. And he did it for one of his like political lobbyist buddies, which is another PR blunder, right? So it's not only was he kind of going against his own rules and having this private dinner party without masks and stuff, and then it was also for like a political insider whose job it is to influence politicians with money.
Yeah.
So the scandal got pretty big and people got pretty upset. And what used to be kind of a joke, which is the whole recall Gavin Newsom thing in like 2019, because if you're unaware of California politics, every single governor ever gets a recall movement ever since, because we have recalled governors before in California. So now, since that's happened, every governor gets a recall movement, and they're not really taken seriously. But now this one is getting a little bit more, taken seriously, because like I said, half of LA County got COVID. And then he had this scandal where he was like flaunting, like disobeying his own rules with his rich political elite buddies. And he ran on like homelessness, and which is just getting incredibly worse, especially now with COVID. It's skyrocketing. So the recall movement is getting a lot more steam. He's in hot water. His presidential, because this guy definitely wants to be president. I mean, he is a smooth-talking, good-looking politician dude who's got the straight white teeth, and he is like what you put in an HBO show of like, oh, who's the president? Let's just put in this guy. He is that, and I know you can tell he wants to be president in the way he talks and acts. This might hurt it. Because it's not a good look.
Yes. And I hope we could get our buddy Mitchell on eventually to talk about this. We'll see how that goes. But I think, man, that the big problem is that politicians are hypocritical. It's always happened. Nancy Pelosi gets busted getting a haircut when she shouldn't be. She blames it on a setup. It wasn't. Gavin Newsom says he's not eating inside when there's a chandelier behind him. Dude, you're eating inside. Just be honest. And I think Trump set a precedent that you don't apologize, you double down. And Ted Cruz did it too. Cancun Cruz.
Right.
He didn't apologize. He said it was a bad decision and blamed his children. And it's a bipartisan issue. I think Trump has shown politicians that you don't really need to apologize, because we've always done this. And I think social media has just like shined a light on the hypocrisy. But that being said, like, to me, I was actually quite pissed off with the Gavin Newsom one, mainly because, I'm from Truckee up at the Tahoe area, and I've been here working remotely this year. And I remember ski resorts. Gavin Newsom allowed them to remain open because of, outdoor physical health, whatever it was. I forget the exact terminology, but it was like for mental well-being. But these ski resorts are all owned by mega corporations. Like Vail Resorts owns like every ski resort in the West Coast, minus like 3. So this is not some like mom and pop company. This is a giant corporation that is still being allowed to be open, but all the restaurants around the ski resorts are ordered to be closed. And so basically Vail Resorts in North Star, for example, which is in Truckee, they can provide food from their own cafeterias, yada, yada, yada. And I think about the same thing in LA. You had studios that, were allowed to remain open, and you had mom and pop catering companies like that literally were not allowed to be open, that usually would be providing them with food, what so not. And instead, like, it's this double standard of, okay, we're allowing corporations to be open or larger businesses, but the mom and pops aren't. And so this recall is obviously mainly driven by small businesses. And I get it. And I agree with you that I think that politicians are always hypocritical, and it's just with social media, it's becoming more apparent. But at the same time, like, I'm fine with a recall, to be completely honest. Like the last Republican governor of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger, won in a recall in 2003 against the Democrat, who I have his name here. It was Gary Davis.
Right.
Or sorry, Gray Davis, I think it was.
Davis.
And Gray Davis, yeah. And so I'm honestly fine. I think it's democratic to hold a recall. And I just really quick wanted to go over this because there's a great New York Times article that's called What to Know About the Efforts to Recall Governor Gavin Newsom. And it basically talks about how you need 1.495 million votes or signatures, to recall him. And right now there's 1.1 million, but 798,000 have been verified. But that's where it gets complicated because you have until March 17th to get that 1.495 million votes. But right now there's only 1.1 million, but they need to verify all of them. And because this is an online movement and it's a lot of online, sign up on GoFundMe or whatever the kids are using these days, but it's really hard for state officials to actually verify that these are individual people doing it. So they've actually extended it from March 17th to like mid-April for the actual Secretary of California, or the Secretary of State of California, to actually verify these. And then it gets even more complicated because then within 60 to 80 days after the verification of, say, there are 1.495 million signatures, then the not the Secretary of State, but the Lieutenant Governor, not Gavin Newsom, but the Lieutenant Governor has 80 days to call for a recall vote at that point, because this is only the signature phase. So they're saying that it would not even be until November or December that we actually would have this recall vote happening, because right now we're in the signature stage.
Right.
But I do think that watching a man who shut down local businesses and allowed corporations to still operate, who's sitting in the French Laundry talking to lobbyists, I do think that's kind of a rot in our democracy that needs to go. And this recall is different than other ones because they are actually close to the needed amount for the lieutenant governor to actually look into this. And I'm fine with it, man. I am.
Well, look, I certainly think that if they get the signatures for the process, the process should happen. I'm not going to sign the thing because I am disliking what I'm seeing from Gavin Newsom recently. I don't think it's worthy of a recall. I think what I'll do is I'll just take it into consideration when it's the next planned election. But I also see your concern. I mean, I hear you, man. I don't you have a legitimate reason, and that is why I was kind of caveating that in the past recall movements were kind of a joke, but now they're really serious. Or this one is getting steam and is serious. And again, if it goes through the process, gets the signatures, then yeah, the process should happen. It's a good thing that we have the ability to recall governors. But I don't know if I would consider I don't think it was an abject failure. I think it was bad PR, and I think that, and I do think that he should do more to help the small businesses. But in this other op-ed about how it is no reason to take him out, if you look at the data of, this guy also cites, expanding the healthcare coverage in California and 3.5 million housing units, but out of the COVID, there it is. So 25th out of 50 for COVID deaths per capita. So that's middle of the pack. That's not great. It's not terrible. It's literally the middle of the pack. 19th out of 50 for its proportion of population received the vaccine. So if you go by those metrics, he's doing a little better than average, which is not great, but it's not a total abject failure to respond to COVID. In my opinion, it's really bad PR that will probably hurt him in the next election.
Yeah. And, let's slowly get into, I think, Texas. But the last thing I'll say, which is kind of a good bridge, I think, between the two, is that I think there's a reason why there's not a spotlight on Greg Abbott. Well, now maybe more so with the Texas blackout issues. But at least involving COVID, it's because he was honest from the day one. He's like, we're not going to shut down all the businesses. We're going to let you eat outdoors. I think the glaring problem for me in California is that we're still middle of the road. It's not like we stopped the pandemic by shutting everything down.
Yeah.
And someone once told me, if someone shows you who they are, believe them. And Gavin Newsom, he put all these very draconian measures into place, and then he's maskless indoors with a bunch of lobbyists eating.
That's true.
And Greg Abbott never did that. He from day one said, we're not going to follow all these draconian measures. And that's where I'll stop. But that's my issue with Gavin Newsom, is that he was kind of fine with telling everyone else to be good, but he didn't have to be himself.
Yeah, definitely. I mean,
but I understand your points. I don't think this recall is going to change anything, but yeah,
it's still worthy. It is valid. To me, it was not valid 2 years ago, but now it's valid. I still might not fully support it, but it's a valid recall attempt. But yeah, let's get into Governor Abbott, because this is an interesting situation where it seems like a problem outside of his control. You have the Arctic storm, basically, that swept over the middle of the country, especially Texas, and brought cold weather that Texas had not ever seen. And it caused power blackouts. It caused pipes to burst. It caused people to die. I think the death is up to 40 now as a result of like weather-related deaths, whether that's freezing or death or, hypothermia. I guess it's freezing to death as well. But anyway, it's a huge problem. It's a big major crisis. You've probably heard about it if you're from the United States. And so Texas is now in the spotlight over its electrical power grid. And we could probably do a whole episode on this alone, but we just have to touch on it a little briefly. But the idea is that there was such a demand for power when there was such a huge cold streak where people needed to, heat up their water or use electricity for the heater. There was such a demand in power that the Texas grid could not match. And Texas's power grid, it's on its own. It's not a member of like the Eastern Seaboard grid or the Western grid. It's on its own by design. And it's getting a lot of criticism now because there was not much reserve power. Some people have been saying that the fault lies with the green energy because wind turbines and solar power was underperforming for that period. But as well as a lot of people are saying that the natural gas industry was to blame for the blackouts because natural gas as well was significantly underperforming for the demand that was needed during this storm. However, the point I want to make is that while I think that Governor Abbott is disingenuous in his criticism of green energy, because he the first day he started to blame green energy and he's since walked that back. I think that was lame. I think that was dumb of him to do, and it was kind of a political talking point. But I don't actually blame Governor Abbott for the Texas power grid issue. I was listening to a 538 podcast today with a reporter from Dallas, and she had looked into it, and basically she's like, in my findings, she had found that this issue with the power grid and the supply and demand of the power grid is not something that is like the result of one particular electoral body, but of decades of neglect in Texas. In fact, in 2011, there was a cold storm that had led to a study looking at, hey, can we actually survive these cold weather systems like this? And the study had found that no, they were ill prepared for a cold weather storm of a significant magnitude. But given that they were so rare in Texas, the government had decided not to do anything about it. So this is not just something that's like Governor Abbott's pulling the switch, right? I can't blame Governor Abbott for the blackouts, but it does seem like he is now in the spotlight because he should do something to change it in the future.
Yes, no, I absolutely agree with that. I think that the problem is he's the figurehead of a long-term prolonged crisis.
Right.
And I think it's the deregulatory ideology of Texas lawmakers. I call myself a libertarian sometimes, but I think there's a dangerous side of libertarianism where you don't like the idea of a regulatory body to control something like a power grid. And I remember it was Rick Perry who bragged about Texas was not on the main grid. He bragged about how Texas was decentralized. Texas was all these D words, like DE, put next to something that probably should have been happening. Right. And that's what happened, in my opinion, is that it's not Greg Abbott's fault. He's the figurehead of it.
Right.
And of course he's a Republican, so he's going to tout the messaging. But it was, you're right, years of neglect. The fact that there's a national grid, there's national communication, and Texas opted out of it.
Yeah.
And I do think, and this is just one of these theories I'm putting out on the spot, so don't criticize me too much because I haven't done enough to really fine tune it. But I do think that if you're a state that has deregulated your power industries, and then on a national scale you're being subsidized to incorporate renewables into it, I think you're going to have a problem. Because when you have a once in 100-year storm like we're seeing here, and you've kind of been incentivized by the federal government to start using renewables, but we all know that renewables are less reliable during a time like this, I think we have a factor of maybe this is proving us that we are still far away from relying on renewables for stuff like this. But at the same time, also, we should have been checking that natural gas, that our coal plants, that our nuclear facilities were more prepared. But if you're so focused on federal subsidies to bring in renewables, that maybe you're going to miss some of that. So that's why I like to point fingers on both sides. I like to say that it's not green energy, it's not fossil fuels, it's a broken state that was maybe forced to adapt to renewables before they were ready or had the funding to do so.
I'll take that olive branch because you're right. Like if let's say if Texas was completely supplied by wind energy, this still would have happened because I don't think that Texas's wind turbines were what's called winterized. However, there are wind turbines now, and I didn't know. And the thing is, I don't think anyone should have expected them to be, unless maybe after that 2011 storm where they did the study. But it's understandable to think that, well, we probably don't need to have wind turbines that can survive negative 20 degrees if you're in Austin, Texas. However, we are seeing with climate change that incredible weather systems happen. The idea that this is just because it's super cold is not a product of climate change is ridiculous. I think that we're going to see crazier polar vortexes and stuff like this more often. But there are things you can do with green energy to make it winterized. Sweden even offered their information of how they winterize their wind turbines. But again, I can't blame Governor Abbott for preemptively winterizing his turbines if it is a 1 in 100 year storm. So no, it's not like if Texas was completely green energy, this wouldn't have happened. But I also don't think it's an excuse to then not invest in green energy, because like if you look at the ERCOT, which is the company, the regulatory agency that oversees Texas's power grid, they show the levels of what's being output and everything. Natural gas was way below the expected output during the time of the storm. So that is a culprit, right? So there are a couple culprits. I don't think we should necessarily stop subsidizing renewables. I think it's a good thing. You're right that it's maybe not there to completely rely on wholeheartedly, right? This is great evidence to say we should not completely rely on wind turbines. I buy that. I'm with you there. But it is also a good argument to say maybe we shouldn't completely rely on fossil fuels either. But but let's not forget who gets a bunch of fossil fuel lobby money is Republicans in Texas. So that's why that's why I say it's not surprising when Governor Abbott, within the first days of the criticism of the storm, he said, well, it's the green energy. This is what AOC wanted, like if we had a Green New Deal, we'd be even more screwed. And I'm like, dude, I think that's disingenuous criticism. I think you're pointing the finger in one direction when we need to point it in like five. And part of it is, we need to get maybe Texas intertwined with national systems so that things like Oklahoma, if they were tied together with the national grid, Oklahoma would have been able to give extra power to Texas, but they weren't because they were disconnected. Or New Mexico would have been able to give extra power that they had been, outputting to Texas, but they couldn't. So there's a couple things. But I guess to wrap this episode up, because we were way over time, is that, we have to be looking at our governors and their responsibilities for these different things. I mean, we see scandals with Governor Newsom, scandals with Cuomo, and I do think that both of those will play a part in their politics in the future. I hope they do. I hope Cuomo resigns, like I said before. He won't, but I hope he does. I don't necessarily blame Abbott for the storm and the deaths, but I do think that we need now to hold him accountable to make changes to avoid it in the future. And then Desantis is an interesting case because he's more popular than ever, and I don't think he's particularly a good governor, but he's definitely someone to keep an eye on for the future of the Republican Party.
Absolutely. And the last thing I'll just say is that on Greg Abbott, I'll save that because I'm sure we'll talk about this. But I think this episode's important because I think over the last year, especially with the craziness of Trump and how horrible of a leader he was, that it became very easy to say Democratic governors that have put the fist down have been good, and Republicans that have not put the fist down have been bad. And on a scale of how governors have weathered the last year, I would actually put, surprisingly, Greg Abbott at the bottom and Cuomo at the top. And I think a year ago, people would not say the same thing.
Yeah. Well, this is welcome back to regular American politics, folks, where everybody sucks. All right, that's going to wrap up this episode. This is a chunker of an episode, but I hope it was enjoyable and informative for you. Let us know your thoughts on these governors, who's good, who's not, any other governors you're concerned with, and what it means for you if you're a member of these states. Thank you for listening to the Tonic Accord. Check us out on Spotify, YouTube, Podbean, Apple Podcasts, and I think a plethora of other third-party sites. Have a great night, and stay safe and stay sane. Okay.
Sweet. I'm going to run to the banyo real quick. I don't think it was bad that episode was long, just because we had so much to cover. I think that's all right.
We did.
Well.
Okay. Well, yeah, go ahead, do your thing. I'll be chilling.
Sweet. Why do I have to pee so much? Maybe I should get my prostate checked out.
Damn, dude. Yeah.
My dad did have prostate cancer, so.
Oh shit. Well, then yeah. I mean, hopefully it's just because you're hydrated.
Well, I also had that one cocktail with the family before we started, so that's probably part of it.
There you go. That's probably it.
I'll be back. Sorry, brother. All right. Okay, we good?
Shoot, I was muted. Hey, what's up?
Oh, okay, sweet. Awesome.
So you wanted to intro this filibuster one?
Yeah, I yesterday had some time, so I kind of wrote down some notes on just kind of how the filibuster was unlikely to happen, but it happened. So, yeah.
Oh, do it. Let's do it. Yeah, that sounds interesting. All right. Yeah, you just start it off and just drag me in whenever you feel ready.
Sounds good, brother. Let's do it.
All right. Recording in 3, 2, 1.
Hey, what's up? Hello, everyone. And today, Drew and I are going to be talking about the filibuster. And it's something that's been, depending on which side you're on, it's been either popular or not so. And today I just want to talk about how it was kind of unlikely that the filibuster was even going to happen. But it did, and now it, to some, is a defense of the minority, and others a way to allow mob violence or allow the mob to have a voice when maybe they shouldn't. So we're going to talk about that today. Hey, Drew, how are you, man?
I'm doing good, dude. I'm doing good.
Yeah, so I've yeah, as good as we all can be. I mean, hey, the vaccine's starting to roll out. I'm kind of happy my dad finally got his first shot. Our county has not been super quick about it, but he's in his 70s, and so I'm glad to see that. So things are starting to look up, I think, a little bit, at least in the COVID days. But now let's talk about our ever-aging and sometimes flawed Democratic Republic. So before we start, I just wanted to give kind of a background on the filibuster, because I don't think it was actually ever designed, and it just kind of happened by chance. And so basically, everyone bear with me for a minute or two here, but so basically the filibuster was in ancient Rome. That was the first time we've heard the term of filibuster, obviously Latin version of it, but there was something where you could just basically grandstand and babble and stall policy inside of ancient Rome. But for the sake of this podcast, the founders never actually mentioned the filibuster in the Constitution. The only idea, or let's just say discourse of it, was between James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton was more of a federalist, more big government guy. I guess you could say I would call nowadays more of an establishment Democrat. And James Madison to me seems more like a rural constitutional conservative. And basically, Alexander Hamilton worried about any way where the idea of a minority veto would be a poison to democracy. That was his words. He called it a poison. Any way where the minority could veto majority decisions would be a flaw. But then Madison was worried about the tyranny of the majority idea. And so he supported the Electoral College and ideas of allowing debate even when a popular policy was up in the Senate. And so what fascinates me is that the filibuster did come by accident. So basically, let me see, I have it written here.
It's about
the
cloture, right?
Yeah, and well, it was also so the House and the Senate had a rule book in the late 1700s that both had something called the previous question motion, which basically in simple terms ended debate in either house through a simple majority. So if you had 51%, you could end debate. So you're not going to allow a filibuster. So now in 1806, I think it was, this rule wasn't used, and so the Senate actually decided to get rid of this simple majority block on debate. The Senate was like, hey, we need to simplify our rule book, and so they got rid of it. They scrapped it, and so the House didn't. So now, basically what happened is the House still allowed, so the House did not allow this growing, like, stalling debate happening, but the Senate all of a sudden started allowing it to happen. So now, move ahead a few decades, the filibuster as we know it really came into fruition during the pre-Civil War kind of antebellum era, where you had Andrew Jackson's presidency. He was controversial, corrupt, not liked by the other side. And during this period, it was slave-supporting Southerners who actually would use it to basically stall legislative decisions. So you had John C. Calhoun, for people who are not aware, South Carolina politician, quite racist, said that slavery was for the greater good. And he basically realized, and to his credit, he recognized this, that there was no way to end a debate in the Senate because, like I said earlier, they scrapped that motion rule, which would have ended it. So he basically used this a lot, and a lot of other Southern Democrats did, to basically stall talks about the abolishment of slavery, which over time, we all know how that ended. And so now bear with me again, so we get to Woodrow Wilson, who is also not a great guy in terms of racial policies, but he actually, for his defense, was quite against this because he said it's a just complete travesty that a minority can basically, hijack policy debates. And so actually after immense negotiations, the Senate adopted the cloture rule, which is actually what we have now, but evolved, which would now allow 2/3 to cut off a debate. So you needed 66% of the Senate to cut off a filibuster. And so people thought that, okay, with this, the filibuster is over. The fact that now you can actually have not a simple majority, but a supermajority stop the filibuster, okay, it's over. But we had the civil rights era come into fruition. And again, we saw Southerners use the filibuster as a minority party to stop civil rights laws. And so again, in 1975, after huge debate, they actually were able to reduce it from 66% needed to stop the filibuster to 60%, or 3/5. And that's where we're at today, which is so now, if you wanted to stop someone from stalling legislation through debate, you need 60%. And now, because I think a lot of, especially more Republicans or groups that know they're in the minority in the Senate, now they can just threaten the filibuster and people listen. And so it's actually interesting to see how the filibuster was never meant to exist really in its current stage, but it does, and it always works for the minority party.
It's like the it's a terrible analogy, but it's like the whole of a donut. Like you didn't even realize it was there, but now once you realize it, it's like a pivotal part. That's a terrible, stupid analogy, but I see what you're saying, right? Like I think what's kind of funny is, this idea that it wasn't even supposed to exist, but then once it did exist, then people were filibustering the debate to end the filibuster. Like people were using the filibuster to even keep, like it says here throughout the 19th century, that whole Civil War era, opponents would simply filibuster the motion to ban the filibuster, which is crazy. And I think it's a really unique thing with our American politics, this idea of the filibuster. It's definitely like a political 101 buzzword, like, oh, you're into politics, tell me what a filibuster is. And yes, it's extremely gear grinding in the Senate to have these filibusters. Basically, you can have people just spew for hours and block legislation. And the debate is interesting because, that debate of how do we prevent a tyranny by the majority is legitimate. But then I would argue that the filibuster simply just hinders progress of any party at all. I mean, if you really can just say I'm filibustering and block legislation and require a supermajority to end that, like, that doesn't really seem democratic to me. My first gut reaction is to get rid of it.
Yeah, and I'll get to that, get rid of it in a minute, but yeah, Alexander Hamilton said here, in quotes, to destroy the energy of, I'll backtrack. He basically said this is why he didn't like the idea of something like this. He said, in quotes, to destroy the energy of the government and to substitute the pleasure, caprice, or artifices of an insignificant, turbulent, or corrupt junta to the regular deliberations and decisions of a respectable majority. And I always think of Tea Party here. Like, I think that is why for the Tonic Accord here, for the current landscape of the politics, I think the filibuster was again abused by the Tea Party. And, I at the beginning thought I actually liked some of what the Tea Party was saying. They were kind of against the establishment. They wanted to see, people get a voice again. But over time, it basically became, we're not for policy. We're just against Obama. And so over time, it became in political science, they talk about this all the time. It's really easy to rally people against something. It's really hard to get people for something. And I think that's what Trump did very well, was he rallied people against Democrats. There was never a policy alternative. And so, I think the Tea Party was the predecessor for that. And that's why we started to see the filibuster again become a topic over the last decade. Is because these guys just got in there and said, oh, we're against the Affordable Care Act. We're not going to provide an alternative. We're just going to talk and talk and talk and delay this. And so I understand Alexander Hamilton's criticism back in the 1700s when he said, this is just going to entertain the minority who is against where the nation's going.
Yeah. I think so. I mean, that's how I kind of see it. It's being utilized as a cheap political way to just stall a legitimately elected legislative body. There are some famous filibusters where they're done by people I might align with more, but still I think overall filibusters should go. Now, can they go? Can they be removed? That's the tough part, and that's where it's really not likely. I mean, again, one is you have to have a certain supermajority. 60 you said it was, to even end the filibuster and talk about changing that rule. Is that right?
Yes, that is. Yeah, you need 60% to even end that debate.
I mean, good luck. Our Senate right now is 50-50 deadlock with obviously the VP vote to break that deadlock, but that will never get to 60. That's not going to get to. I think it's going to be really tough to eliminate the filibuster. And then again, you have that problem, is what I said earlier, is you can literally filibuster to prevent the ending of the filibuster.
Well, and interestingly enough, we're already eroding at the filibuster, at least in certain appointments, right? Like Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell, ironically, agreed in a bipartisan effort to erode that filibuster option, where it was Harry Reid who used the nuclear option to get rid of presidential appointees or cabinet members, right. Which basically, for those who don't know, it means you need over 50%. You need 51% to approve this candidate. And then Mitch McConnell furthered it to Supreme Court justices. And the thing is that I'm worried that if we got rid of the filibuster, it actually could backfire, because obviously Democrats in 2020, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, if the filibuster existed, could they have potentially forced some sort of discussion before the election so things could have been different? Maybe. I don't know. But I think it's more complicated than that too, because like you had that Bernie Sanders thing up, and it's interesting because Bernie Sanders is against abolishing the filibuster. Joe Manchin is. Joe Biden said he is. Jen Psaki a few days, or I think it was about a month ago now, actually, said that also Biden has not changed his opinion on that. And so I almost feel like we need a milquetoast, half-assed compromise here. Is there a way to improve some aspects of the filibuster, without getting rid of it entirely, like somewhat of a half-assed nuclear option? I don't know.
Is there a way to have a rule that will eventually cause the close of debate on legislation, but without feeling like people are forced, and without allowing someone to stand up there eating milk balls for 4 days straight, which is what Strom Thurmond did for 24 hours? How do you find that balance? Because, I imagine Bernie. I imagine, it is that, right, who's in power at a certain time. I imagine right now, Democrats don't want Republicans to filibuster any of their legislation in the Senate. I also imagine in the future, Democrats will probably want to filibuster Republican legislation in the Senate. So I can see why, you would have, all these political elites not trying to get rid of it. However, is there maybe a better way to have the rules of the Senate have a closure or cloture of a debate? I'm not exactly sure. I'm not exactly sure what that would look like. I'd have to do more digging. But I certainly think that the idea of the filibuster is strange, and the fact that it came out of this loophole almost and has grown into this massive political mechanism that the Senate can utilize is troublesome. I think it's weird. I just think it's weird that you can just talk forever and no one can tell you to shut up within reason. There needs to be a certain point where you tell someone to shut up.
Right. And I would even go back a little bit and say that I think that even if we got rid of the filibuster, then it would almost intrinsically destroy the idea of the Senate, because it was James Madison again who talked about how the Senate was meant to be an apparatus that allowed the minority to have more power. And we've talked about this before as well, is that, the House obviously is more aligned with population density and with where the country actually probably is. But the Senate is this pragmatic apparatus where it does favor minority rule. And so I just feel like it would backfire. It would really backfire to get rid of the filibuster. And it's not because I like the filibuster. But then again, as I'm saying this, it was James Madison who also said that the idea of the Electoral College and or some sort of debate, obviously the filibuster wasn't the word he used, but he said, in quotes, it would stop people who are subject to the infection of violent passions or to the danger of combining unjust measures. But as we saw on the storming of the Capitol on January 6th, obviously that didn't happen. The Electoral College or the filibuster or the Senate are not stopping mobs. His idea was that these guys are elites, these guys are smart and elected, and they can maybe go through the craziness and make it sound better. But clearly, I think we've seen the other side of it, is that actually the mob controls the Senate. The mob controls Congress. The mob controls the voices of these elected officials. So if the mob wants this guy to go filibuster for 2 days, he's going to do it, not because he's going to stand up against the mob, but because the mob wants him to. So it's almost like the founding fathers were wrong. The founding fathers were wrong in the fact that these apparatuses would stop mob violence. And so that brings us to this weird conundrum where probably our government's just outdated, Drew.
I think so. I think it could use some tweaking. That's for sure. That's an interesting point of the idea that this would slow down mob mentalities and trendy political waves. But in reality, in today's world, we're seeing it do the opposite. Is interesting. Another thing about that tyranny the minority issue is let's look at today's Senate, and this is with the help of the Now Simplified guys. I looked at the Now Simplified page, and they had a great stat, and they looked at the current Senate, which is 50-50 Democrats, well, essentially Democrats, and 50 Republicans. The 50 Democrats represent 184 million Americans, whereas the 50 Republicans represent less than 140 million Americans, right? So you have a literal even representation in the Senate, but the actual weighted power is on the minority, is on the Republicans represent less people, but have the same amount of voting power as the larger group, the 180 million. So that right there is evidence that it exactly is that. It is the Senate currently is protecting the minority opinion more through voting power than the majority. Now, that could be good, but I would argue most of the time that it's bad. You should not have a body that most of the time is not proportionally representative of its electorate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and through history, especially, the filibuster has been used to stall popular ideas. It's, okay, abolishing slavery, civil rights laws.
Yeah, the Civil Rights
all these
Act,
things. Right. Exactly. These were all times where the filibuster was used to stall something that most Americans wanted. And I hear you there. But again, like I'm saying, I think, yes, now simplified, and I know Mitchell on the podcast has even mentioned it. But at the end of the day, the Senate was exactly designed to do what it's doing. And so I think it's not fair to say, okay, well, Republicans represent less people, but they have more seats in the Senate, because that's exactly how the founding fathers thought it would work. And I understand in theory why that is the case. I do, because, okay, the House is the one who streamlines bills based on the trends of the population. So if you have New York and California or whoever agreeing on something, then yeah, Illinois, or I guess Illinois has gone pretty Democrat, but okay, North Dakota is not going to be able to stop that. But you get into the Senate, and now there is a more nuanced debate about it. And I think for a specific reason, it was meant to be that way. But again, over time, just like the Electoral College, we've now had a Republican president. Now, Bush in 2004 was the only Republican in the last 3 decades who won the popular vote. And in the same way, Rand Paul should not be able to go sit on the Senate floor for a day and babble about something when most Americans don't agree with it. But again, I don't have a fix to that, because that's intrinsically how the country was developed.
Yeah, well, like you said, maybe the founding fathers got some things wrong. Not everything.
You and I get things wrong a lot, so I'm sure they did.
I imagine if and we were probably about the age of some of these founding fathers. I imagine if we were given the keys to the castle and were told to establish a democracy from the ground up, I imagine you and I would get quite a few things wrong. So I'm not holding it against them, but it is worth knowing that, it's worth admitting that perhaps there are some loopholes and cracks in the way our democracy is set up that we can fix. Now, I think the filibuster should go. You might think that it's here to stay and perhaps for the better. That's okay. I do think, but the filibuster is a good starting point to realize, wow, there's some weird established rules in our government that might not make total sense that we should look at, and we shouldn't just assume that our government is set up the most efficiently. I don't think anyone assumes that. I hope no one does. I don't think anyone would argue that our government is already perfect. But the filibuster is a good example of this is a weird, strange phenomenon in American politics that actually matters and plays into the power of the Senate. And we should take a look at it. I think it should go. I really do. But it's not going. It's not going to go anywhere. And because of the way it is set up, it's incredibly hard to remove. And it will be interesting to see how McConnell's Senate, for now, utilizes it or not against the Biden administration. We really have not gotten too far into the Biden administration's actual legislative moves and how the Senate will respond. So I am interested to see if we'll see some 24-hour filibusters again soon or not.
And the last thing I'll say on that is that, this is the time for the Democrats, which I don't agree with, but it's the time for them to do it, because it's pointless to get rid of the filibuster if you don't have all 3 branches, right?
Right.
And right now they do. But the warning I will give is that Republicans also had this same situation in 2016, or I guess 2017, when Trump was inaugurated, and they didn't get jack shit done. excuse my language. They did not get anything done. So I think it's a warning to the Democrats is that getting rid of the filibuster is not going to be a solve all.
No.
And also there could be issues down the road that you might regret. And that's probably why Bernie and Joe Manchin both aren't particularly for it. And yeah, I mean, but I think it does help us understand maybe why our country's weird. I mean, let's think about it. The founding fathers were afraid of British monarchy. They were all Protestant, or Quaker groups, like basically persecuted religious groups that were afraid of tyranny of the majority. So they came here and wanted to put in some extra like safety nets, right. And maybe those safety nets are outdated.
Yeah, or have been misinterpreted over time or loopholed into something else. But no, you're right. Mm-hmm. You're definitely right. That's a very good point. That they were the persecuted, so it's understandable that they would put in these like stop breakers for the minority. Fascinating stuff. Yeah. I don't know.
No, I mean, we could, hopefully we can maybe eventually get on the constitutional scholar or something and dive into this. Maybe a Tea Party scholar, right? I'd love to pick their brain on why would this still be good. But
sure.
Anyways, yeah, I mean, what do you guys think? Please let us know. F the filibuster, or I effing love the filibuster. I don't know. But anyways, we are on Spotify, and I'm liking to see that jump in numbers on there. So keep it up. We're on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, all that jazz. So yeah, let us know. Tell your friends and take care, guys.
Thank you all.